God wants me to take you, Brother Matthias declared, his voice a silken trap in the cold autumn air. His pale fingers, like the legs of a spider, reached for 8-year-old Rosalie. She flinched back, her small hand clutching the simple wooden cross at her neck. It was all she had left of her mother. It was all she had left of anything. "Over my dead body," a voice growled, low and rough as scraped leather. Caleb Turner stepped between them, a ghost of a man, a dust-covered cowboy who drifted into Cedar Ridge on a river of whiskey and grief, and now he stood like a granite mountain between the preacher and the child. The wind whipped through the dusty street, carrying the tension like a disease. The whole town was watching. Widows clutched their shawls tighter. Merchants left their stalls, their goods forgotten. Children, their games abandoned, peeked from behind barrels and crates, their eyes wide with a fear they didn't fully understand but felt in their bones. Rosalie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum beat against the silence. The two men faced each other, a wolf in sheep's clothing and a wolf who'd long ago forgotten how to be anything else. Brother Matthias was dressed in pristine black robes, a stark contrast to the grime of the frontier town. He smiled a smile of practiced piety, but his eyes, cold and gray as a winter river, never left the trembling child. He saw not a girl, but a thing, a possession. Caleb's weathered hands hovered near the worn grip of his Colt, his jaw set so tight it looked like it was carved from stone. He'd come to this town to die, but looking at this terrified little girl, something he thought long dead and buried flickered to life inside him. "The child needs spiritual guidance," the preacher continued, his voice smooth as honey, but with a sickening sweetness, like something left to rot in the sun. "She's been alone since the fever took the last of the orphanage staff. God himself has spoken to me in prayer. She belongs in my mission." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. They were God-fearing folk, taught to respect men of the cloth. But the stories that drifted down from the mission on the hill, they weren't stories of God. They were whispers of something else entirely. Rosalie's fingers tightened on her cross, the wood digging into her palm. She watched the cowboy's face, saw the weariness in his eyes curdle into something fierce, something protective, something she hadn't seen since her own father was alive. "Ain't no God I know would want a child in your care," Caleb said, his voice quiet. But the words cracked across the dusty street like a bolt of lightning, and everyone knew the thunder was about to follow. The confrontation they'd all whispered about, the one they'd all dreaded, was finally here. And little Rosalie, an orphan with nothing but a wooden cross to her name, stood at its deadly center. The crowd pressed closer, a circle of fear and morbid curiosity. Brother Matthias, unfazed, reached into the deep folds of his black robes. He produced a document, an official-looking paper with a wax seal that rustled ominously in the wind. "I have legal authority," he announced, his voice rising, projecting to every corner of the street, to every fearful heart. "Signed and sealed by the territorial governor himself. This child will be educated in Christian virtue at my mission. It is the law. She is an orphan in need of salvation." He held the paper aloft like a holy scripture. It was a powerful weapon in a town that clung to the fragile rule of law. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, wrung her hands, her face etched with worry. "Maybe, maybe it's for the best," she whispered to her husband. "The poor thing needs proper care, a roof over her head." But her husband's face remained a mask of skepticism. He remembered the whispers, the rumors that drifted down from that mission like smoke from a poison fire. He remembered the eyes of the children who came back. Caleb spat into the dust, a gesture of pure contempt. His eyes never left the preacher. "I've seen your kind of salvation, brother," he said, his voice dripping with acid. "Children go into that mission with smiles on their faces. They come out silent as tombstones, if they come out at all." A shiver of unease went through the gathered townspeople. Every person there knew of a child who had gone to the mission, and every one of them knew that the child who returned was different, changed. Sarah Bennett, the town's young schoolteacher, a woman who believed in rules and order, stepped forward hesitantly. "Perhaps we should consider—" "There is nothing to consider," Brother Matthias snapped, his mask of piety slipping for a fatal second. And in that second, The crowd saw something else in his eyes, something cold and ravenous and utterly devoid of light. The law is clear. The child comes with me. Today. His gaze fixed on Rosalie, and it was the look of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. Rosalie pressed herself against the rough, splintered wood of the orphanage wall. The cross cut into her palm, a sharp, grounding pain in a world that was tilting into madness. She'd heard the whispers too. In the quiet of the orphanage at night, the older children would talk. They talked about the strange, rhythmic chanting that echoed from the mission late at night. They talked about the children who arrived hopeful and left with eyes that looked 1,000 years old. And they talked about the ones who simply disappeared. The cowboy glanced down at her, just for a moment. She looked up into his dark brown eyes and saw something that made her chest ache with a desperate, forgotten hope. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Something that reminded her of her father. A fierce, unyielding protectiveness that said, "I will not let them harm you." "You want the girl," Caleb said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word a stone laid in a wall between the preacher and the child. "You'll have to go through me first." Just then, a figure pushed through the crowd. It was Sheriff Hawkins, his tin star glinting dully in the afternoon sun. But the face above the star was a study in conflict. His weathered features showed more uncertainty than authority, and his hand, resting on the butt of his gun, was not the steady hand of the law, but the trembling hand of a man caught in an impossible choice. "Now, gentlemen," he started, his voice strained, "let's try to keep this civil." Brother Matthias turned his cold smile on the sheriff. "There is nothing uncivil here, Sheriff. I have the paperwork." He waved the document again. "And this man," he gestured dismissively at Caleb, "has no legal claim to this child. No standing whatsoever." The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow. She saw the cowboy's broad shoulders tense. He was a stranger, a drifter. What right did he have? The law was on the preacher's side. The whole world was on the preacher's side. "Legal don't make it right," Caleb replied, his voice still quiet. But now it held a dangerous edge, like the slide of a knife from its sheath. "Every single person in this town knows what happens at that mission. Every single one of you," he said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, challenging them, accusing them. "And you're all going to stand by and let it happen again? Because of some piece of paper?" The crowd shifted, a collective rustle of unease. Faces were torn, caught between the fear of a man with a government seal and the growing, sickening certainty that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Then a new voice broke the silence, a voice cracked with age and grief. Old Pete Morrison, who'd lost his only grandson to the mission 2 summers ago, stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. Tears streamed from his rheumy eyes, tracing paths through the dust on his wrinkled cheeks. "The boy came back wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "He came back wrong. Wouldn't speak. Wouldn't eat. He'd just stare. Stare at nothing at all. He died within a month. And I swear on my dear wife's grave, it wasn't a sickness that took him. It was that place." Brother Matthias's face hardened into a mask of cruel piety. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, old man. Not every soul is strong enough to handle his divine truth. The weak fall away. It is natural selection, guided by God's own hand." The casual cruelty of it, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance, made several women in the crowd gasp. Rosalie felt hot tears burning her eyes as she looked up at the cowboy, this stranger who stood like a mountain between her and the darkness that wanted to swallow her whole. "Please," she whispered, a sound so quiet only Caleb could have heard it. "Please, don't let him take me." The cowboy's jaw clenched. He looked down at her, at this small, terrified child, and he saw a ghost. He saw his own daughter. The standoff stretched, taut as a bowstring, the world narrowing to the space between two men. But Caleb's mind wasn't on the street anymore. It had drifted back 3 years to a memory he'd buried so deep he thought it could never be unearthed. 3 years ago, his own daughter, Emma, had been just Rosalie's age when the cholera swept through their homestead like God's own silent, invisible scythe. He remembered her tiny hand in his, her body burning with fever. And he remembered the wooden cross necklace she clutched, a necklace identical to the one Rosalie held so tightly right now. He remembered how she'd whispered her prayers, even as the fever stole her breath, her faith unshaken even as her small body failed her. His wife, Mary, had followed Emma into the cold, hard ground within a week, leaving Caleb utterly alone, with nothing but a bottle of whiskey and a mountain of guilt for company. He'd come to Cedar Ridge to drink himself to death in peace, but something about this terrified child, with her familiar wooden cross, had stirred the father's heart he'd thought was long dead and buried forever. "You got children, brother?" Caleb asked suddenly, the question cutting through the preacher's pious sermon. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "God has blessed me with a higher purpose than mere earthly attachments," the preacher replied smoothly, his voice once again dripping with false humility. But Caleb saw something flicker in his eyes. A hunger, a possessiveness, a desire for control that had nothing to do with God. "Earthly attachments," Caleb pressed, his voice like iron. "Like protecting the innocent? Like making sure little girls get to grow up safe and loved instead of broken and afraid?" The crowd sensed the shift. The momentum was turning. Faces that had been turned to the preacher now turned to the cowboy, like sunflowers following a new, brighter light. Brother Matthias's composure finally began to crack. "This child needs discipline, structure. She needs to understand her place in God's great plan." "And what place is that?" The question came not from Caleb, but from Sarah Bennett, the school teacher. Her conscience had finally won its battle with her fear. She took a step forward, her chin high. "What exactly do you teach the children at your mission, Brother Matthias?" The preacher's eyes went cold as winter stone. "I teach them that suffering purifies the soul, that obedience to divine will supersedes all earthly comfort, and that sacrifice, sometimes extreme sacrifice, is necessary for true salvation." The words hung in the air, thick and foul as smoke from a hellfire. Even Sheriff Hawkins, a man who had seen his share of darkness, took an unconscious step back. The crowd's unease was transforming, sharpening into something dangerous. "Tommy Fletcher didn't need purifying," a broken voice screamed from the back of the crowd. Heads turned to see Martha Fletcher, her face a gaunt mask of grief and rage. "My boy was perfect. He was 8 years old, pure as the driven snow and gentle as a lamb. You took him for spiritual education. And when I finally saw him 6 months later, he could barely speak my name." The crowd parted as she stumbled forward, a woman hollowed out by sorrow. Tears streamed down her sunken cheeks, but her eyes burned with a fire that could have melted steel. "He had scars, brother. Do you hear me? Scars on his back, scars on his wrists. And there was something in his eyes that wasn't my boy anymore. Something broken and terrified and empty." Brother Matthias's mask of piety didn't just crack this time. It shattered completely. "Sometimes the flesh must be mortified to save the soul," he sneered, the last of his pretense gone, revealing the monster beneath. "Sometimes pain is the only teacher a stubborn child will understand. Your son, he was particularly resistant to God's love." The admission of torture, so casual, so cold, hit the crowd like a physical blow. There were gasps of horror, angry mutters that grew into a low growl. Men who had been standing on the sidelines now clenched their fists. The scrape of boots on the wooden boardwalk echoed as people moved instinctively, not away from the confrontation, but towards it. Sheriff Hawkins' hand finally moved decisively to his gun, but Brother Matthias just laughed. It was a sound like glass breaking in a silent church, sharp and ugly. "You think your pathetic frontier justice concerns me?" he mocked. "I have authority from the territorial capital. I have influential friends in the highest of places. I have God's own mandate to do whatever is necessary to bring his light into this darkness." He gestured grandly toward Rosalie, his certainty absolute. "And I will have this child, today." Caleb felt a rage building in his chest, a wildfire of pure, righteous fury. This was it. This was the reason. This was why God had let him live when Mary and Emma died. Not to drown his sorrows in a bottle, but to stand here, right now, a shield between innocence and an unspeakable evil. "The only authority you've got," he said, his voice now deadly quiet, the calm at the center of the storm, is the authority we let you have. And that ends. Right. Now. His hand blurred. Faster than thought, faster than a snake strike, his Colt was in his hand, the long barrel gleaming in the afternoon sun, leveled directly at the preacher's black heart. The crowd held its breath. Decades of frontier justice, of hard choices and harder men, all came down to this one moment, this one choice, this one stand between light and darkness. The tension shattered. "We can't let him take her," shouted Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, his massive hands, usually so gentle with iron and fire, clenched into fists the size of small hammers. Not after what he just admitted. Not another one. But Mayor Collins, a man whose spine was made of jelly, scurried forward, his pale hands raised placatingly. "Now hold on. Let's be reasonable. We can't just ignore a legal document from the governor. There are proper channels. There are courts, appeals. Tell that to Tommy Fletcher's ghost." Martha's voice cracked like a whip, silencing the mayor instantly. "Tell that to the 6 other children from this town who went into that mission bright-eyed and came out broken." Sarah Bennett, the teacher, moved to stand beside Caleb, placing a protective hand on Rosalie's shoulder. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I've seen those children in my classroom," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Whatever happens at that mission, it is not education, it is destruction." Brother Matthias smiled his cold, reptilian smile, sensing the division, the lingering fear in men like the mayor. "Fear makes good people say foolish things," he crooned. "These people know that challenging divine authority always brings consequences. Ask yourselves," his voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper, "do you really want to stand against God's chosen servant? Do you want to bring his wrath down upon your homes, your families?" The threat, veiled but unmistakable, hung in the air. Several townspeople, the ones with the most to lose, took a nervous step back. But old Pete Morrison hobbled forward, his cane tapping a defiant rhythm on the wooden boardwalk. "I already lost my grandson to your divine authority," he spat. "I ain't about to stand by and watch another child disappear into that hell you call a mission." The town was splitting right down the middle, a jagged line drawn in the dust. Some backed away, seeking the safety of non-confrontation. Others moved closer, forming a ragged line behind Caleb and Rosalie. Sheriff Hawkins stood between them, his face a mask of torment, torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the conscience he had to live with. The tin star on his chest felt heavier than an anchor. "The law," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the noise, his eyes locked on the preacher, "is only as good as the men who enforce it. And sometimes, Sheriff, doing what's right means choosing between what's legal and what's just." Rosalie, sensing the shift, pressed closer to the cowboy's leg. Her small hand found his, and he felt the familiar shape of her wooden cross pressing into his palm, a silent promise he knew he had to keep. Sheriff Hawkins stood frozen, caught between two impossible choices. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him that order was paramount, that authority must be respected, that chaos was always, always worse than injustice. But the preacher's casual admission of torture, the sight of Martha Fletcher's grief-stricken face, the terror in little Rosalie's eyes, it had shaken the very foundations of his world. "Sheriff," the preacher said smoothly, sensing his weakness, pressing his advantage, "your duty is clear. Enforce the law as it is written, not as it is interpreted by this angry mob and a drifting cowboy with no standing in this community." The words stung because they were true. Caleb was a stranger, a drunk who'd wandered into town 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and a past he was trying to outrun. What claim did he have on this child? What right did he have to defy the law? But then Hawkins looked down at Rosalie. He saw the raw terror in her 8-year-old eyes, and he remembered his own daughter at that age, a girl full of laughter and boundless trust, a girl who believed the world was safe because her father wore a star on his chest. "Legal authority," the sheriff said slowly, his voice rough but clear, carrying across the silent street. "It comes from the people, and if the people don't trust that authority to protect their children, then maybe that authority needs to be questioned." Brother Matthias's face contorted with rage. You are making a grave mistake, Sheriff. My friends in the territorial capital will hear about this defiance. Your badge, your pension, your entire future, all of it hangs in the balance right now. Maybe so, Hawkins replied, and his hand moved from his gun butt to unpin the star from his chest. He held it in his palm, the metal suddenly feeling cheap and meaningless. But I've got to sleep at night, and I can't do that knowing I handed a child over to a man who proudly admits to torturing children in the name of God. He dropped the star into the dust. It landed with a soft thud, a sound that echoed like a gunshot. As a citizen of this town, he said, his hand now resting firmly on his gun, I'm standing with the cowboy. The crowd released a collective breath they hadn't even realized they were holding. The momentum shifted, suddenly and irrevocably, like a landslide. Brother Matthias was no longer facing just one defiant cowboy. He was facing an entire community, a town that had finally found its courage, finally willing to stand against the evil that had been hiding in plain sight. You'll all regret this, the preacher hissed, his voice venomous, his composure completely gone. There will be consequences for this, consequences that will reach every single family in this God-forsaken town. But his threat was cut short by a new sound. The creak of wagon wheels, the soft thud of horse hooves in the thick dust. Every head turned. Three figures on painted horses had arrived, materializing at the edge of the crowd as if from the very air itself. Their presence instantly changed everything. They were Apache warriors, their faces grim, their eyes missing nothing. The leader, a tall man with silver-streaked braids and eyes like chips of obsidian, surveyed the scene with the patient, lethal intensity of a hunting eagle. Behind him, two younger warriors sat on their horses, their faces painted for war, their hands resting on the weapons that could end this entire standoff in a handful of heartbeats. Sheriff Hawkins, no longer a sheriff but just a man, let out a slow breath. Stands with thunder, he said, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. He recognized the Apache chief who occasionally and cautiously traded in Cedar Ridge. This is town business, Brother Matthias spat, trying to reclaim some shred of his authority. It has nothing to do with you savages. The child has everything to do with us, the chief interrupted, his accented English sharp and precise, carrying an absolute authority that no government paper could grant. He pointed a long, weathered finger at Rosalie, who peered out from behind Caleb, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She helped my grandson. He was lost, hungry. This man, he gestured with contempt at the preacher, his men would not help. They called him a heathen dog. But the little one, the one with the wooden cross, she gave him her own food. She showed him the path back to us. His dark eyes fixed on Rosalie. She has honor. From this day forward, she has the protection of my people. Brother Matthias laughed, a harsh, grating sound. The testimony of a savage means nothing in a civilized court. These heathens have no understanding of Christian law or divine authority. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Stan's with thunder's eyes went flat and deadly. Heathen, he repeated softly, and a cold dread washed over the crowd. You speak of divine authority, yet you torture children and call it God's work. He dismounted from his horse in one fluid, silent motion. He began to walk towards the preacher, and for the first time, Brother Matthias looked truly afraid. He took an instinctive step back. My people, Stands with Thunder continued, his voice a low growl. No evil when we see it. We smell it on you, like death on carrion. This child will not go with you. The other two warriors dismounted, moving to flank their chief, their message clear, silent, and unmistakable. There was no law here but theirs. A grim smile tugged at Caleb's lips. The odds had just shifted, dramatically. Looks like you're outnumbered, brother, he said quietly. Way I count it, that's 3 warriors, 1 ex-sheriff, and me. And that's not even including the good people of this town who've finally seen you for the snake you really are. Brother Matthias's composure crumbled. He was trapped. His paper was worthless. His threats were empty. He was surrounded by an armed town, a determined cowboy, and Apache warriors who looked at him with eyes that promised a slow and painful death. This isn't over, he snarled, his hand diving inside his black robes. I'll be back, with federal marshals, with territorial troops, with... His threat ended in a strangled gasp. Caleb's Colt, which had never wavered, was suddenly cocked, the sound echoing like a hammer blow in the tense silence. The only thing you'll be returning in is a pine box if you don't get on your horse and ride out of here right now, Caleb said, his voice carrying the cold finality of a closing grave. And if I ever hear of you coming within 100 miles of this child, or any child, I will hunt you down like the rabid dog you are, and I will put you in the ground myself. Stands with Thunder stepped forward, a war club seeming to materialize in his grip as if summoned by dark magic. Among my people, he said, his voice chillingly calm, those who harm children are not given a quick death. They are fed to the desert, slowly, piece by piece, while they still live to scream. Your God will not protect you from Apache justice. The crowd surged forward, their fear finally burned away by a tide of righteous anger. Martha Fletcher, the grieving mother, picked up a stone from the street. Get out, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Then louder, a scream of pure fury. Get out! Others joined her. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, hefted his hammer. Sarah Bennett held a wooden ruler, but in her grip, it looked as deadly as a blade. Even old Pete Morrison hobbled forward, his cane raised like a weapon. Brother Matthias looked around at the ring of hate-filled faces, and for the first time in his life, he felt the icy grip of true, mortal fear. You're all damned, he hissed, backing away towards his horse, his eyes wide with panic. God will punish this defiance. Mark my words, he will strike you all down. Then let him come himself, Caleb replied coldly, because you sure as hell aren't welcome here in his name. The preacher scrambled onto his horse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the reins. His carefully constructed world of authority and fear had been shattered beyond repair. As he wheeled the animal around to flee, Rosalie, emboldened by the wall of protectors around her, stepped out from behind Caleb. She held her wooden cross up, a small, defiant gesture. For one brief moment, their eyes met across the dusty street, the innocent child and the monster who preyed on innocence. And in that moment, the monster flinched. Brother Matthias rode out of Cedar Ridge as if the hounds of hell were at his heels, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of a dying crow. But no one watched him go. Every single eye in that street was on the small girl standing in the center of it all, her little wooden cross necklace catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The dust settled. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. Caleb knelt in front of Rosalie, his movements slow and gentle. His big weathered hands, hands that knew the cold steel of a gun, were surprisingly tender as he helped her straighten the simple leather cord around her neck. Your mama gave you this? He asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. She nodded, the tears finally coming, streaming down her dust-streaked cheeks, washing them clean. She said it would keep me safe, Rosalie whispered, her voice choked with sobs. But she died anyway. And I thought maybe God didn't hear the prayers of little girls. The cowboy's throat tightened until it ached. He was back there again, in that small, dark cabin, holding another little girl's hand, listening to another little girl's prayers go unanswered. He remembered the cross he had carved for his Emma, so much like this one. Another promise he'd failed to keep. But this time would be different. This time he had been given a second chance, a chance at redemption, a chance at being a father again. Oh, he heard you, Caleb said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He heard you loud and clear. He just sent help in a different way than you expected. Stands with Thunder approached, his fierce warrior's mask gone, replaced by an expression of gentle understanding. He knelt beside them, a towering figure made gentle by the presence of a child. In my language, he said to Rosalie, his voice a low rumble, there is a word, Takoja. It means, precious child under our protection. You are Takoja now, little one, protected by the cowboy, protected by this town, protected by Apache honor. The bad man will not return. The former sheriff stepped forward, picking his star out of the dust and polishing it on his sleeve. Not to wear, but as a reminder. "I'll be riding to the territorial capital first thing in the morning," Hawkins said, his voice firm with new purpose. "I'm writing a full report. I'll tell them everything. Whatever authority that man claimed to have, it's gone now. We'll see his whole rotten mission burned to the ground." The crowd, which had held together in a moment of crisis, began to disperse, but not before person after person approached Rosalie. They didn't crowd her. They came one by one, with gentle words, with small gifts, with promises of protection. Sarah Bennett offered her a place in the schoolhouse, promising to teach her to read and write. Martha Fletcher, her eyes still filled with sorrow, but with a flicker of light in them now, promised her home-cooked meals every single day. Tom Bradley, the big blacksmith, told her he would forge her a set of beautiful iron animals to play with. This small, abandoned girl, who had nothing, suddenly had an entire town. As the sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson, Caleb lifted Rosalie onto his broad shoulders. He walked towards the boarding house at the end of the street, which he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, would soon become their home. Her little wooden cross swayed gently with each of his steps, no longer a desperate talisman against evil, but a symbol of faith fulfilled, of prayers answered, and of promises that would this time be kept. In the end, God had indeed heard a little girl's prayer. He had answered it with the fierce, unexpected love of strangers, who in a single afternoon had become a family. He had answered it with the courage of ordinary people who, when faced with true darkness, chose to stand together and be the light. Rosalie's wooden cross was a link to a past she thought was gone forever, but it became the key to her future. Sometimes the smallest objects hold the biggest secrets and the greatest power. What family heirloom holds a special meaning for you? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe in second chances, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and hope.